But to close it out under the tent, we are talking sulfur. The nice thing about this conversation is it's a pretty easy one to have. I think what we're going to talk about, show you, I think we'll all agree sulfur is definitely the thing we want to start thinking on. We think crop fertility, right? NPK. Heard a little earlier about maybe molybdenum, cobalt, some other micronutrients, but definitely sulfur, and we'll talk a little bit about why. But I think it's also important to remind ourselves where we stand and why we put sulfur as the cleanup batter. Right, so we have our baseball field here, and we kind of learned first up to bat was probably seed treatment. Get that right first because, well, that's got to go before anything even goes into the ground. And then we put that seed and it makes that first hit and we're out on the first base. We got our first player out there. And then you got to have the right hybrid or the right variety, thinking corn or soybean, to make sure we maximize and optimize the value of that system. And this is a baseball field, right? But we got to put the right seed in the right field at the right time. Dr. Lohman told us about that. And then we got that next base run hit and we're moving around the bases, starting to load them, not quite loaded yet. Seed treatment's pretty cost effective. Seed, pretty cost heavy when we think about it, but it's a valuable asset to the team, and you have to have good seed, and you're putting that money into it. You want the most out of it, and that's where Jared and Sam and Ava have talked about setting good 4Rs, P and K fertility, getting everything off to a good start, and that loads the bases. And now we got to say, what's going to bring everyone home? What is the next thing to make sure that those bases do turn into achieved runs and that we don't just go 3 out in the end of the game? And thinking a little bit, the bottom of the ninth, we're getting to the end, right? Baseball, for those that have played, 1 inning or so is not too physically demanding. We need to compare that to football or soccer or cross country. But it's a long game, isn't it? Right, baseball's a long game, and when you're getting to the end of the game, you can be tired, and you're wanting to know who's going to carry the team all the way through. I got a photo here, and hopefully it shows up on the TVs for you, but you might notice a little bit of discoloring towards the bottom as you get into the lower whorl there. And this is from Dr. Bielo's program, a little bit before my time, 2006, Champaign, Illinois. 3rd year continuous corn. They started to see this, probably one of the first times this symptomology was showing up in the research plots a little more consistently, and they kind of started thinking, what is this? And based on the title of the talk, I think many of you can probably take a guess where we're going. But that was 2006. Have we seen this since then? Right? I'm going to guess yes for a lot of you. We have. Here it is at our southern site, a little more prominent there. That's 2017 in Nashville, Illinois, and that's a 2% organic matter soil. Why that's important? Sulfur does come largely from soil supply in the organic matter, and that has traditionally been enough to meet the crop yield demand. But we've been hitting those grand slams lately, haven't we? Higher yields, higher nutrient demand, probably starting to see need for things we hadn't traditionally thought of in the past. And that's where we kind of come to what we're seeing now more frequently is this sulfur deficiency. And why, right? And this is, I don't think, anything too unfamiliar to you either. The first thing is we have decreased atmospheric sulfate deposition. We looked at our air and our factories and said we're putting too much coal and other dust up in the air. We need to clean that up, and by golly, they did, right? Clean Air Act came out. And what you have on this chart on the left side is in 1985, we're getting more than almost 8 pounds of sulfur per acre per year falling, just natural deposition. Then we cleaned up our smokestacks. Less going in the air means less coming out of the air. And now, 2021, right, less than 2 pounds. So green means less falling. So we have less natural sulfur deposition in our fields. So that's one of the reasons we're starting to see it. And we have higher purity phosphate fertilizers. So phosphorus fertilizers traditionally have a little bit of sulfur contamination, but as companies refine them, get them more concentrated to the nutrients of interest, they start to remove things like sulfur, which means you're no longer applying sulfur without knowing it. Because if the impurities were there, you were just applying it for the phosphorus, getting the sulfur with that ride, but now we've got pure sources, maybe not as much going out than we used to. And then, like I said, just having higher yields, higher soybean yields, higher corn yields all around. That's more nutrient removals, and a lot of sulfur makes grain, so it's going down the road. Just how much sulfur do we need to grow a crop, and then what goes out with the grain? I'll use some good averages for a lot of the state if we think 230 bushel corn and 60 bushel soybean. And here you have in the left column, total amount of pounds of sulfur to produce, and then the amount of pounds removed in the grain. And you might see that 23 pounds for corn, that's 17 pounds for soybean. What's the average of 17 and 23? 20. And what do most people, when they're talking sulfur, say recommended rate? 20 pounds. This is where that comes from, why we think that's what it's going to take. But then you look at how much is being removed in the grain. It's definitely over half of that, so 14 and 10 pounds with corn and the soybean, 230 and 60 bushel corn and beans. But these are maybe, for some of your farms, yields from 5 years ago. Some of us are moving beyond 230 bushel corn and 60 bushel beans. So for those of you that have hit 300 bushels or 80 bushel Grand Slam soybean yield, how much sulfur did that take? And how much are you now removing that you maybe weren't 5 years ago? And it's 30 pounds now to get 300 bushel corn and 23 pounds to get 80 bushel soybean, and much more on the removal rate. Actually, if you look at the difference between those older yield levels and the yield levels we're shooting for today, you need 7 or 6 more pounds per acre of sulfur to produce those yields, and that means we're removing 4 or 3 more pounds as well. So it just keeps stacking up on top of it. We got less falling, and we got more removal. Kind of going back to the physiology, right? We have to do a little bit more physiology today. It's crop physiology day. Why? When we think about fertilizers, we know the crop needs it, but do we always remember ourselves why crops need N, P, K, sulfur? And so a little bit of biochemistry today, don't worry, it's the only lesson we'll have, but what do we use sulfur for? It is largely to make protein. There are 20 naturally occurring amino acids, and amino acids make proteins that is largely also associated with plants' nitrogen needs, right? There's nitrogen in every single one of those. Not every single one of those has sulfur, but 2 of them do. That's cysteine and methionine. Those 2 amino acids require sulfur, and that is very important for building proteins. So you need the sulfur for those 2 amino acids to get the rest of the protein. And by the way, 2 out of 20 is a 10-to-1 ratio, and that's why we often hear how much sulfur? 10-to-1 with your nitrogen rate. It comes down to the actual physiology of how proteins are developed and amino acids. That's where it's going, why it's important, and they're really crucial for the structure. For those that remember, right, sulfur has in those amino acids creates what they call disulfide bridges. It ties things together, grabs it on both sides, brings it in. Very important for structure. That goes in the grain, and then other compounds down the road. It's kind of a train event. This is why we need sulfur and why we're needing more of it. And what we've been doing in the crop physiology lab for the last decade. And so here is the last 10 years of studies and a number of trials in corn or soybean and some of the representative sites we've done this at. And I'll put a line here, right? So 2016 to 2017, you notice there's a pretty significant jump. We have a lot more sulfurs in the last 9 years than we did the prior. Is that coincidence? Or what we like to refer to those first 2 years as years 1 and 2 BC. It's before Connor. I did start working with Dr. Bilo in 2017. So we're doing more sulfur because of my interest, maybe a little bit, and also some of the other speakers beforehand. Dr. Lohman's involved in a big chunk of that center, and Dr. Vitor Favaretto is involved in a lot of that chunk in the center, did a lot of their work on sulfur. So I'll just go through a few case studies, different ways we've used sulfur, different ways to think about the formulations, and why we are excited about what it can do to bring home the rest of the team. So this is an example of our small plot down in southern Illinois, but the first question I have is, can fall applied sulfur benefit corn yields? Why fall specifically, right? A lot of us are putting our P and K out in the fall. So if you can add another nutrient at that time, it's a free ride of application. But what's the one problem when you hear sulfate? What does it sound like? Sounds like nitrate. Are they similar? We get a lot of questions. Does fall applied sulfate leach just like nitrate? And therefore, is that a recommended practice? So we went out to test this. I say we, this study I'm about to go through is Dr. Lohman's, part of his PhD work, so get full credit there. But what does fall sulfur give us? And we did this over 4 years in different fields around the farm here. Actually, one of them was just over there to the east. These are standard, Flanagan, Drummer, silty clay loams, the mollisols. And they were conventionally tilled in corn soy rotation. So we're going out there and we're harvesting the beans, applying the sulfur, and then doing corn next year. So that's a fall broadcast fertility on soybean stubble. Our first soil sample was that next spring. So we applied in the fall, but before planting, we're gonna go measure the soil. How much of that P, that K, that sulfur that we put out in the fall is still there, is available, can we detect it? And then we keep going. Not only is it there before planting, but how long into the growing season is it available for crop uptake? So we did a second sampling after that year's corn harvest. So that's 1 full year after we applied. And then the third one was, is there a residual? Does it stick around for that second year when you go back to soybean in a 2-year rotation? And we just glutton for punishment sampled at 4 different depths. We went 0 to 6, 6 to 12, 12 to 24, 24 to 36. Right, 0 to 6, 6 to 12, that's the root zone. If it's still there, that's great, it's available for uptake. Why you go deeper is it moving like we think nitrate might in a similar example? So I just want to show you one example in that corn pre-plant, because the main question is, if I apply it in the fall, is it still available in the spring? And there's a chart I'm going to put up here that we'll walk through together. But you have the depth on the y-axis, the left side, in inches, going down, right? So it goes from 0 at the top down to 36. That's your soil profile as you move. And then there are 3 different treatments. The dashed lines there on the left side is our untreated control. That's no sulfur applied. Then we have in the dark blue, or dark black circles filled in is ammonium sulfate, 100% sulfate form, or compared to microessentials S10, which is 50% elemental, 50% sulfate, all balanced for 20 pounds of sulfur there. And what you can see then on the x-axis is the sulfur soil test in part per million. That is, the more to the right the dot is, the higher the soil test, and at the different levels we measured. And sure enough, there's a lot of sulfur in the top half, but as you move deeper, you get less of that available. That's just tracking a lot with the organic matter. One of the interesting things, though, is one, we can still find it. Both sulfur sources are much greater in availability than the no sulfur control. So it's still there. And interestingly, though a balance of sulfate only or sulfate with elemental made no difference in this case. So your sources, you have flexibility there on availability. Still there, applied it in the fall, still there in the spring. This is the 3-year average from the 3 different years we applied it. That's exciting, knows that we can maybe have confidence in that. But then is it there through the yield side at the end of the year? And sure enough, it was. So here's the average 3-year yield, 219 bushel corn, and we got either 8 bushels to MAP, 7 bushels to ammonium sulfate, or 10 bushels to microessentials. Why I didn't show the MAP on the previous one, there's no sulfur with that MAP, so we were just focused on the sulfur. But we did compare MAP because it is a phosphorus response, is it a sulfur response, or in this case, a little bit of additive when you have a source that has both. But really exciting, fall applied sulfur can have a benefit. That's the 3-year average, which means some years there's a little more, to corn yields. You can apply that in the fall. Where things get interesting, though, and where I've talked to a lot of producers, they're doing strip trials, looking at sulfur. They say, what did you see this year? But then I ask, did you follow it up the year after? No, we did the same trial in the field across the road, so I can see if I could repeat that year over year. How many of you doing strip trials on your farm check the yield monitor next year where last year's trial was? I'd highly recommend start to look at that, because the cool thing was when you follow those soybeans, they're still responding to that fertilizer that was applied almost 2 years ago. And you can see the same trend, that sulfur, especially on the AMS, sticking around, and the sulfur plus phosphorus in that microessentials granule there was the best return on that. But it's cool to think about the long-term value of fertility, and sulfur is not leaching as much as we might think. Why? What's going on in our soils that holds sulfur available? CEC, sound familiar? Cation exchange capacity, cation, positive ions, soil's ability to hold them. We don't talk much about AEC, anion exchange capacity. Our soils can hold anions, right? We're taught that nitrate leaches because it's a negative charge. The soil's negative, it doesn't work, it goes through. But one of the things about measuring things is there's different ways to measure it. And Dr. Mulvaney has been working on new ways to measure AEC. And there's 2 different older methods in the darker squares, and then in the tall rectangles, that's the new method. And the story here on this picture is those unfilled rectangles are all much higher than the old methods down below. What this shows us is our soils probably have a much greater anion exchange capacity than we think about. And that's why they can hold sulfate and get you those 1 and 2 year responses. So really exciting thinking about that, thinking about our soils a little differently in terms of their ability to hold sulfate. And like I said, back to the amino acid, sulfate has a -2 charge. The soil can hold it in 2 different spots. And that might be why it doesn't move as much as nitrate that would have a single charge on it. So, and then just for reference, that drummer right there, we're looking at about a 6 AEC, whereas the old method would say maybe it was 1. So that's the why that's going on with this study of the why sulfurs can be held in our soils. So that 3-year study that Marcos did, right, corn was sulfur or phosphorus responsive, and we did find there was a synergy to have them together, or an additive effect. Soybean was responsive to old sulfur applications, giving that 2-year benefit. Right, this matches a lot of what Sam was saying. That 2-year blend, the soybean picks it up the next year, and that AEC is probably higher than we thought, and that's giving us that benefit long term. That was question 1. Question 2 then, is there an advantage to spring versus fall? Right, if we have that option, what if we did both? There's another study we did over a couple times, but I'm going to show you one here. Different sulfur sources, right? We have the ammonium sulfate, it's all sulfate based. We have the microessentials, which is 50-50 elemental, which breaks down over time. Polyhalite is also sulfate, but in a different granule, so it actually dissociates a little slower. And then we have Cistera and gypsum on there, and the calcium sulfate. Fall versus spring, and we're going to look at the soybean grain yield response. So here's all the numbers, right? But I, like Ava, enjoy the Christmas color scheme, especially when it's all green, right? So that's all green. So the good news is all our fertilizer responses were positive for that soybean. But interestingly, if you look at the bottom, you'll notice that the fall had a much higher average than the spring. And we're seeing better response to fall on soybean than spring applications. Again, mirroring that first study I showed you and some of what Sam's got going on, soybean tends to prefer old sulfur fertility. Why? The good news is that's my job security, right? So I got to have questions to go answer to say I'm employed at the extension side. But one of the things I think that's starting to pick up with trends and observations, what does soybean typically follow, right? Well, higher yields, that's one. It's a lot of residue there. For those of us coming from north-south, double cropping. And now we got a lot more cover cropping or even no-till cover crop systems. That's a lot of residue. And we talk about residue, we talk about the C to N ratio, right? This is why residue ties up nitrogen. And if you're higher on this list, you induce nitrogen immobilization. And if you're lower, you induce nitrogen mineralization. And a lot of us are planting beans into this corn stover, 57-1. Back to earlier conversations, beans need a lot of nitrogen. If you're putting 80 bushel beans behind 300 bushel corn, you probably need to figure out a way to enhance that fixation or the soil supply. How many other ratios do you typically talk about with your agronomist? Anyone talk about the C to P ratio, the C to K ratio, C to S ratio? I think we should start talking about it. What is the C to S ratio on average for corn stover? Right, 57-1 is not a good day for nitrogen. 351 is an even worse day for sulfur. This is why I think a lot of folks are seeing sulfur responses in high residue scenarios. There's some work, I think the Field Advisor Soybean Association, they just found sulfur in cover crop beans is having an effect. I think a lot of it comes down to C to S ratios, helping stimulate residue management. So is it a nitrogen or is it a sulfur problem? I don't know, maybe we'll find out, but I think that's where it's going. And just to show an example of this on the cover crop side, this is my third research question, right? Cover crops, we had a 23 soybean yield, 2024 corn yield. Head of the soybean was cereal rye, head of the corn was crimson clover. 2 years in a row, same static plot, going back to the same area. And we did have some cover crop yield penalties. Now I will say we had a high biomass. We were going for those 2-ton biomasses for the weed control. Probably need half of that for the nitrogen management. So this is a heavy case scenario. I'm not too surprised, and that was also a dry year. But when we added the sulfur treatments, ammonium sulfate broadcast spread, or ATS, ammonium thiosulfate, as a liquid, you can see compared to the no cover crop, we're still losing yield. But in that second year, the cover crop with AMS, that's 2 years in a row of 20 pounds, so we're now 40 pounds over 2 years, actually had a 7 bushel gain over the no cover crop. Now, this is probably largely a sulfur response, right? But in this case, we're really interested on what happens in a cover crop system with sulfur. Now you have the differences of the sulfur compared to the cover crop control. And in all 4 scenarios, it's working for us. We're really excited about what that can do for these higher residue scenarios. And like I said, we want to be able to do these better cover crop managements for soil erosion things, and this might be a tool to help us manage that a little more effectively, and we close the gap on that yield penalty. So some of the things on the residue side, nitrogen, right, still important for residue. C to N ratio, I'm not saying forget about it, I'm just saying think about other ratios. It's important for high residue systems because it helps with that decomposition. And a lot of times I hear fertility is bad for soil microbes and soil health. The reality is our crop loves NPK, sulfur. Microbes love especially NP and sulfur. I think a lot of what we're doing with these sulfur nitrogen treatments for residue management is feeding the microbes to break down the residues to help benefit the next year's crop. So don't forget about that aspect of it. And then we have one third final example about in-season sulfur, right? So you can do it in the fall. It works. You can do it in the spring. Spring actually works pretty good on corn too. You can do it in cover crop systems, right? We're 3 for 3. Are we 4 for 4? What about the in-season application? And why this is so important, if you are growing 230 bushel corn and you need that 23 pounds, the maximum uptake, the slope of that curve, is 0.62 pounds of sulfur per acre per day from V10 to V14 when that crop's going from here to here. And actually about 25% of your total sulfur need is taken up in just 6 days. That's where things like Y-drop sulfur make sense to make sure we can meet that demand. By the way, if you can make 7 pounds available in that short period, maybe now we have a 250 bushel crop. That rate of uptake can limit your yield potential. So I'm showing you a study we did 3 years. I'll show you the 3-year average. What we have is an untreated control. This is just a base rate of nitrogen. We had 160 units up front. Pre-plant broadcast. Hey, that's a pretty good return. 242 bushels on 160 units of N. We Y-dropped another 60 units of nitrogen, UAN around V6. And we gained 7 bushels to that additional 60 units. But what happens if we compare nitrogen-sulfur sources in addition to just nitrogen? So all of these were balanced for an extra 60 pounds of N, but we added 20 pounds of sulfur as either top dress AMS with urea or that sulfur Y-drop with ATS. And we see the yields here. We get an extra 2 to 3 bushels on top of just the side dress alone. Sulfur making that nitrogen more efficient because, like I said, these are balanced for that. So now we're 4 for 4 on sulfur. Hopefully I've convinced you that sulfur can be our cleanup batter because the broadcast has a 2-crop advantage, corn and soybean. Sulfur is especially responsive in high residue systems. I didn't show it to you today, but we have similar responses in continuous corn. And then in-season side dress can be beneficial for higher yields. So when you got everything set up and the bases are loaded, who do you want to take you home? Right now I'm thinking you might want to be thinking about that sulfur as our 4th batter to get them there.